Thanks, Gahirlock, and thanks for the Samaritans coming in today in relation to their statement. I think their role over the last 50 years in this country has been immense. Their humility and their kind of non-judgmental listening has been had a huge effect on those that kind of seek Samaritans' help, and it's testament to the Samaritans themselves that there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of people alive today in Ireland because they reached out at that particular time and people listened to them and changed the kind of course of their life. So thank you for that. There's been obviously some of the questions that I had written down. Normally this happens when you're kind of sometimes last. Most of these questions have been answered, so I'm not going to duplicate anything. But so just one question in relation to obviously the pandemic has been traumatizing for the world, really. It has kind of has a sense of kind of has a huge effect on people, but sorry about that. But in relation to what legacy has the pandemic left in relation to kind of legacy issues, in relation to loneliness, that kind of people found themselves in that position, and what issues have they encountered in relation to the kind of where the pandemic has slightly come to an end, and what effects do they feel that that legacy issues will still occur in relation to not only the kind of collective in society, but obviously the individual, because there's no individual without a collective, and vice versa, and that's very important, because what we have seen in the last 18 months, especially in Ireland, is people coming together like no time probably in our living memory. And when people come together, they can do extraordinary things, and they have done extraordinary things. There's a collectivization of how we can actually overcome a pretty terrible pandemic, and that's the best of humanity, the best. And we have seen that, but there's also certain things that have happened that have left a very, very kind of serious kind of chasm and legacy in relation to the certain things that went on in the last 18 months. But what legacy issues from that pandemic do you, in your kind of in your daily kind of observations, that we need to deal with? If you can answer them questions. So sorry for the disruption there. Just
it's okay, Gino. We didn't hear anything, so all good.
Okay.
Thank you, Deputy. I suppose one of the legacies is that people who never had a mental health issue have struggled with mental health through the pandemic because of restrictions, and we were all locked down for a period of time. And I think particularly with an older cohort, a friend of mine said, he's probably in his early 80s and he's active, he said, a year out of my life is a huge chunk. So, I think some people will struggle that didn't struggle in the past. And I think also some people are struggling to go back out into social situations for fear. And how that can be resolved is we have to help those people. But we certainly get calls around those issues from people. And then all the things that happened, like loneliness, isolation, anxiety, depression, they were all magnified through COVID. And probably there's a fallout on that to come as well, which we would be concerned about. And I think as well, people whose businesses are not going to survive, or jobs that are going to be lost, we need to mind those people. And again, our key message is to get people to talk and not bottle that up. Because if they don't talk about it, there will be, a negative effect ultimately. So again, I think they're the key things to me coming out. Aside from the positive that you say, that people coming together, and that's a good side of it, but there are people who will struggle that maybe never struggled in the past.
Yeah, and just to add to that, thinking like, what happens next, and sort of potential impacts. I mean, we know as an organisation, we know as community groups working in the past, the impact of recession on the general population, on people's mental health, and people beginning to fall into poverty and everything that goes with that, and into unemployment and long-term unemployment. So that will definitely be a concern. I mean, some of the other issues that thinking about in relation to certainly that have come up during the pandemic is an apparent increase, or it's a pretty obvious increase in sort of like areas like domestic violence, and then the impact that is going to have. Addiction as well, particularly alcohol use, and how many people's alcohol intake has increased over the last 18 months, and what's going to be the long-term impact of that on those individuals. And we will probably only see that begin to emerge over the next 18 months, 2 years. I mean, we don't know for definite. So these are some of the things that, as an organisation, as Samaritans, we are concerned about, and we will probably see those stories coming through in terms of the helpline, etc. So we'll have to keep a very close eye on that, and then what are our responses to that as an organisation, but also in terms of conversations with others. I think it's going to be quite a really rocky road ahead, to be honest with you, in terms of mental health. I think some of the positives that comes out of it is in terms of like the conversations are quite open, or certainly more open in relation to mental health, and certainly we would call mental health to be one of the key priorities, if not the priority of the government going forward, and everything that comes with that in terms of resources, etc., which we mentioned earlier on. But there's a kind of like an excitement about coming out of some of the restrictions, but there's a concern around that as well, and it's potentially we're going to see other areas emerge as well. So,
Do you want to come in there, Sarah? Are you okay? Yes, great. Gino?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Just one final question. And again, this may have been answered, I was out the last 25 minutes. Just in relation to the volume of kind of interaction for those that were calling Samaritans over the last 18 months, was there kind of, was the volume of calls and interactions more, or just, compared to, say, pre-pandemic times, in relation to kind of people getting in touch with the organisation?
A double-edged sword to that, because as we said earlier, we were down 40% of our volunteers, so our capacity was well reduced, but again people were doing extra duties, 2 or 3 duties a week, so our call numbers might have been slightly down, but our calls were longer. We did more hours on the phone, so people needed us for a longer time than they would have pre-pandemic. I think we did 100,000 hours on the island and 77,000 hours in the Republic, so that's reflective of there was more need for the caller, whereas previously the calls were shorter.
And what would your typical caller be, wanting to talk about? I know it's kind of not a typical conversation, but what was the kind of the general narrative, particularly in the last 18 months?
All life issues, really. The issues didn't change. They were the same: isolation, loneliness, anxiety, depression, family problems, work problems, relationship problems, sexuality, everything really, every life subject, but they were magnified because people were, not able to get out. They didn't have any way of maybe releasing tension by, through sport or through activities or stuff like that. So, as I said, the issues didn't change, but they were certainly well magnified.
I mean, the other thing to add to that is like, obviously COVID was 1 in every 3 callers were calling directly in relation to COVID and the impacts and the worries and concerns around COVID. But it featured in pretty much every call that we had. Even if a caller wasn't ringing us specifically in relation to COVID-19, it would come into the conversation at some point. But that, you'd be very surprised if that wasn't the case, to be honest with you, over the last 18 months. So.
Okay, thanks. And again, thanks for your amazing work. Continue amazing work in relation to the non-judgmental listening exercise that your organisation does. Thank you.
Thank you, Gino.